Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And Lloyd Williams-Jones.
Hello there.
And together, we're going to explore how we can get the most from talk in the classroom. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
This week, I've been diving back into a book that I read, I think about a year ago. It's quite an old one. I was reminded of it by a friend of the show, Neil Almond. It's called Knowing and Teaching Elementary Mathematics by Leiping Ma, I think, or Leaping Ma. I apologize for the pronunciation. It's a really interesting exploration of the differences between certain aspects of mathematics teaching in America and China, an exploration of what can be achieved when a teacher has adequate or very good subject knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge, and crucially, what can't be achieved when those things are even somewhat lacking. The best bit about the book are these wonderful interviews and discussions with practicing classroom teachers, and you get to see kind of under the hood of their teaching. And as I say, what becomes so apparent is the importance of subject knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, and how that doesn't just weaken or strengthen teaching, but how it literally changes what the teacher is even aiming at, or what they think they're aiming at with certain topics in mathematics. Really highly recommended. You can pick it up pretty cheap actually on eBay. So yeah, one to look out for. What about you, Lloyd? What you reading for?
Well, it's a piece that was actually recommended by Catherine Morgan on Twitter. She recommends a lot of good stuff and sort of caught my eye. And I've sort of put it to one side thinking, oh, well, I've got a bit of space in half term to read that. I'm glad I did, because it's a really, really, really great piece. It's from the Harvard Business Review. So it's a piece called In Praise of the Incomplete Leader. It's by, I'm going to try and get the author's names right now. It's by Akona, Malone, Wanda, Olakowski, and Senge. And basically it's a collaborative piece which that comes together to really sort of boil down this idea that leadership is not about being all things to all men and being able to be absolutely brilliant in every element of it. And it, and I know it's a little cliche potentially that, but this does a really good job of illustrating that. And they boil it down to 4 key elements. I won't spoil it for you. But it's a very insightful article. One I've actually shared with a few other people who are not in teaching as well, because I think it rings quite true across probably different areas. And yeah, I took a lot from it. So yeah, I would definitely have a look out for that. In Praise of the Incomplete Leader. Yeah, and thanks, Catherine, for the heads up and the tag to it. So Kieran, what you reading for?
Mine's also an article. It's by Gareth Metcalf. And it's called Sequencing Maths, Helping Children Spot Patterns. And it was in, I think it was in a while ago in Teach Primary, certainly on the website. And, I would love Gareth to write a book, because he's really clear, he's really concise, and it's one of those rare peeks into his thinking where he sort of outlines really, really clearly with really well-chosen examples how he would make children get a sense of the beauty of mathematics, just by choosing 5 really carefully put together questions. And yeah, even if he doesn't write a book, I think I'll be happy to settle for having him on the podcast as often as possible. But yeah, definitely check that one out. I think I'll retweet this at the same time as this episode going out. So then the focus of this week's episode, classroom talk. As always, I think the first thing we need to do is decide what we mean by classroom talk. How would you define it, Chris?
For the purposes of this episode, I would say, I think what we're going to try and aim at to discuss is classroom talk as discussion either between pupils, and I think a lot of what we'll talk about today will focus on that, but also how that can link to conversations between pupils and teachers, and also more general classroom discussion. What I would say is a lot of what I'm going to be thinking about today, or what I'm going to be driving at, is discussing classroom talk in terms of something a bit extended. So not just those quick back and forth between, say, a teacher and a class where you're looking to see whether they've understood something very briefly, but something that just lasts a little bit longer, where perhaps the focus alongside developing children's thinking is also to develop that oracy, which is so important to their development.
Chris has kind of summed it up quite nicely there in terms of the framing for this episode, and I think, you know, it's quite an interesting one, I think, to dig down into, because yes, we talk a lot about how, you know, it's very in at the moment, you know, checks for understanding, how we construct those, and how we are very forensic in going back and forth with children and things. But actually, it'd be quite nice, wouldn't it? And I'm sure we're going to do, as we're going to do today, is delve into that structuring of children's oracy and the discussions that they have in a class, because I would hazard a guess at this being quite a difficult thing to do. Speaking personally and over experience over time, getting the whole room to be doing this right, I would suggest is a challenge. And so I'm really excited to sort of dig in with you guys into what some of the thinking is around it.
Yeah, it's probably something I should have mentioned as well is what we're not talking about as well. So obviously here we're talking about classroom discussion that relates to the learning at hand. We're not talking about kind of off-task chat, for want of a better phrase. It's tempting to say, oh, well, in the productive classroom, that sort of thing never happens. But, you know, there are sometimes occasions when children are working on a piece of art over a significant period of time. And there are moments on a Friday afternoon where you're just thinking, no, this is just a nice activity. It's been a long half term. Let's just enjoy this. And you're happy for there to be some of this, for want of a better phrase, off task or unproductive chat. That's not what we're talking about here today. We're talking about classroom discussions that link directly to a bit of learning that we want children to concentrate on. As Lloyd says, there's definitely some overlap with things like formative assessment, questioning, etc. But we're going to try and analyze it as its own thing. I was interested also that you mentioned there, Lloyd, about the difficulties of it. And it immediately made me think of something that I hadn't thought of in the prep for this episode, which seems so obvious, but just jumped out to my mind about how challenging it might be and can be when you've got a class where the behavior isn't exactly where you want it to be. So I think everything that we talk about today has to be taken with that as like the background. That's the context of everything we talk about, which is that if certain ways of dealing with things in the classroom are well structured and the routines are in place, then you can start thinking about the joys of extended conversation with children in order for them to grasp the learning. Obviously, regardless of the exact behavior that you've got in your classroom and how you're dealing with it, discussion between children and between the teacher and the class is still an essential component of what you're doing, but it might look slightly different while you are working towards the exact behavior that you want, say at the start of an academic year. So that's something to bear in mind, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, whenever I was thinking about the final question where, you know, perhaps times we want to maybe avoid classroom talk, the first thing I've got written down is that we should avoid it before classroom norms are established, you know, and there is an element of training. So probably, yeah, I'm going to move that to this part because it makes most sense. Yeah, but I would definitely, you know, there are routines that allow you to get the most from it, you know, that we'll cover, I think, as we go through this episode. It's also really interesting that I didn't even think to include teacher-pupil dialogue in classroom talk. The definition that I've got in my head sort of has it ring-fenced as peer-to-peer, you know, so I might actually put a question, because Spotify allow you to do this thing where you put questions underneath the episodes and see how many other people were in the same position I was, where they heard, you know, oh, actually, yeah, that's a good point. That could be classroom talk on some level. Yeah, but I'm totally with you guys. And it sort of shows that we've got a reasonably rich conversation in store here. You know, I did an article about 10 years ago for the EdTM called The Power of Talk in the primary classroom, maybe the primary mathematics classroom. And it was based around some of the work I did for MAST, where we had teachers recording each other and we were looking at what were the children really saying to each other. I've always been fascinated by, you know, like the work of, is it Graham Nuttall, where he really analysed what pupils were saying and their responses to things. So I think it's a fascinating topic to cover, and I'm looking forward to it. So I suppose, dive right in. How can we get the most of it?
Again, I guess to sort of preface some of the thoughts, first of all, where I'm coming from, I think you both hit on it. I've been doing a lot with the ECF with my school. I have 2 ECTs, and we have 3 ECT plus ones who are also doing the ECF as well alongside the ECTs. And for me, it's trying to frame this now with that in mind a little bit of working so hard on routines and working so hard on cultural norms, embedding those things early on. We haven't even gone there yet with the teachers, and that's not part. It doesn't come into part of the ECF till a lot later on, and I think there's good reason for that, because, like you said, Kieran, it's getting that culture right first. Now, it's not to say that we want to kill all discussion and put out the flame of oracy in them because our teachers are not skilled, if you will, enough to do it. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that's the case, because naturally the opportunities for dialogue will present and will, I think it's a very sort of it's a very fluid thing within the teaching process that these points present, because questions arise naturally out of instruction, and I think when questions arise, that there is the opportunity for discussion. Now, that is probably where I would say we would start with the best in terms of the best facilitation of classroom talk. Around framing it around questions to start with, particularly in terms of novice teachers and teachers who are earlier in their career. I guess I'm in that kind of frame of mind. I guess I'm speaking from that perspective. I'm sure Chris will offer more sort of a wider insight. But I think that getting that modeling right, I think, is important. I think children need to see what good oracy is. That needs to be modeled to them. Now, that can be done in a variety of ways. If you're fortunate enough to have another adult in the classroom, I think explicit modeling of oracy and good practices there is important to the children, because there will be some children in that room that just simply won't have seen effective interactions between adults in their home life. And I think we have a duty to show them how it's best to communicate with each other, and then therefore get the best outcomes from that communication. So I would say certainly a modeled question and a modeled interaction between 2 adults is a place to start.
Really like that idea. Yeah, it's something that I've seen in where there's been a really productive relationship between a teacher and a teaching assistant. Often that is a jumping off point for the way to conduct conversations, for the way to ask productive questions, for the way to deal with challenges as well. The number of times I've seen really expert work from a teaching assistant who asks a question that they already know the answer to, but they're just asking it either because they're working with a less experienced teacher and they've noticed that there's a part of the explanation that maybe hasn't quite worked for some of the children, so they're just giving a hint to the teacher to go back round to that, or they're modeling how to deal with not having comprehended something new. So yeah, I think that modeling of oracy, as well as modeling classroom norms that way, is a great thing to do if you're in the fortunate situation to have another adult in the room. And I liked how you attached that idea to the idea of behavior and routines, because I'd say that's number one, really, isn't it? For classroom discussion to work, the behavior in the classroom has to be in a place where it will work. And that comes down to the routines that you have in place and the expectations. And that comes down to really being very clear with what you expect from the talk. Something I would attach onto that, this idea of clear expectations, is perhaps the idea of clear timings. I find that the classroom discussions that I have often benefit from saying something like, okay, with your shoulder partner, take 30 seconds to discuss this question, off you go. That, alongside a silent countdown with a hand of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, so that they've got that time to bring a conversation to an end, because that's quite a tricky thing for children to do. I think that can support in terms of routines. I guess along those lines as well, this idea of embedding routines, this is kind of linked to that. The idea of a seating plan. Those people who know me, when it comes to discussions around behavior management will know how important I think careful thought about a seating plan and being willing to be flexible with that after a week or a couple of days going, no, this isn't working. This child needs a bit more of my attention. And so they're coming right up front or whatever it might be, or these two children, there's a clash there, or they're best mates and they will not talk about learning. They're just going to talk about Arsenal, say. I want them separated, for example. So part of that kind of behavior and routines might be the use of a seating plan. Naturally as well, if you think about seating more generally, if you've got your children in pairs or in fours, how you conduct the classroom talk is going to depend on how they're sat. And I know that sounds really mundane, but if you've got them in pairs, then that's the person they're going to be talking to. And so you need to keep a close eye on whether that's a productive relationship. Whereas if you've got children in fours, you might say, well, talk to a shoulder partner, or you might say talk across the table to your face partner, for example. And then that maybe gives a bit of variety. In short, how you put children around the room will define how that discussion is going to work. The strategy that I go to again and again and again when it comes to talk in class is think, pair, share. I love think, pair, share. I love being able to take the pressure off children's discussion. I love giving children the opportunity to have a think before they start talking. Often in classrooms, I see teachers ask a question, they say, now talk to the person next to you, off you go. And the children that aren't as confident perhaps with speaking or quick off the mark just end up turning to their partner and waiting for them to say whatever it is that they're going to discuss. And I think having that bit of thinking time before they discuss and then before they share it with the class can A, take the pressure off, B, give a nice bit of thinking time, and C, just lead to a slightly more a gentle atmosphere for discussion, which I think is preferable.
I think you can see that when we say, before COVID, when we used to go to CPD sessions in the same room, and they would open up to tables full of teachers. Let's have a conversation about perhaps something that we've only just learned about. And I certainly don't like that situation, through no fault of any presenter that I've ever, sort of listened to speak, just because if I don't know the person and I don't feel there's an established relationship or boundaries, or expectations for the conversation, I'm reticent to take part. So I can only imagine what children who have, much less life experience than I do feel in that same situation. So yes, that's a really good point you bring up, and I'm thinking, hard not to continually advertise Hawks Farm. But when I went, it's the first time I'd seen Think, Pair, Share executed really effectively. They, like you said, they were in twos, turn to the partner, focus discussion, and then back into the lesson. And all those things that you guys have described, they had those routines in place. So there was the timed element. They knew who they were talking to, and I think it speaks to what you said at the start, Lloyd. This is not easy to do, but I think you can get really great conversations with the requisite legwork, I think.
I know Matt, and his work with Step and Hawks Farm and stuff, and I know he's talked extensively about error tracking, and as part of that route you walk, and I'm sorry if I've stepped on any toes there if that was a point, but a set route to walk for what whilst they are having conversation, I think is a really good idea, because you are not just, where you position yourself in the class is really important as a teacher when that discussion happens. Like Chris talks about countdown strategies. I think it's great. Non-verbal cues and things like that. It's a really, really good thing to do because it's not really, you're not narrating over the top of their discussion. I think that's important that you don't interrupt. But certainly error tracking is a really good thing. I just harked back to something that I saw in a training a long time ago, actually, in my career. It's by a chap called Tim Rylands, who sadly is no longer with us. And he did a lot of training around literacy, and this was several years back. And he always gave me a piece of advice once, and I really, really stuck with me to this day. And I think this is a great thing to do if you are encouraging dialogue. Now, this is probably more between student and teacher dialogue, I would say. But I think you could definitely use this, potentially if you were modeling with your adult as well. But he said, just have a cup with you, And he said, you know, obviously not full of hot stuff because you'd be safeguarding central, but a cup that looks like you've got a tea, but it's obviously full of water only, of course. And he said, just take a drink when someone's talking back or thinking of an answer. And he said, because it's a depressurization strategy. Whereas if a child sees you taking a drink, you're not staring them down for an answer. I thought, and I always stuck with this years on, and I still do it to this day. I still have like a cup in my room. Try to anyway. And I think it's such a nice little strategy to help. And I know Chris has talked before about taking the pressure off children, because it's about making them comfortable. It's about getting the culture in your room right for it. And all of the culture comes from the norms, routines, behaviors, and the small things we do to create that. And I think the last thing I would just add at that point is, if children value oracy, if they see that as the norm, is the thing that is valued within the classroom, if the other children, their friends, their peers, because again, and I know we've talked about this on other podcasts, their perceptions and peer perception on, is this cool? Is this a cool thing to do, to talk and sit and talk to my partner? Is that the norms and culture of the room? Because if it's not, and that is very much the case in your room, then they're not going, you know, with all the best instruction in the world, they are not going to talk to each other about the thing you want them to talk to each other about. So I think that, and that's a very complex thing, that, and I know Peps has got a whole book on it, of course. And I know Harry Fletcher Wood has got an excellent book, Chris, that you recommended on, a few weeks ago as well. So there's plenty of things to read about it and things that it can help you to create that culture. But I do think it's a very complex beast.
Yeah, it is an incredibly challenging thing to do. I mean, I think in some ways, the development of those relationships and making effectively learning and this important aspect of learning the norm in your classroom goes somewhat beyond the sort of tips that we can fire out in an episode like this, because it's so much about the culture of your classroom. It's so much about understanding the relationships. I mean, it can be something as simple as working out that you've got a kid that a lot of the children in the class look up to, who is used to not doing things in the classroom that they're asked to do. And with the best will in the world, you working out how to ensure that that individual child learns and engages, and then the rest of the children follow. That might be a slightly controversial thing to say, actually, the idea of that sometimes we need to notice that there's a child or there are two or three that if I get them learning, the rest of the class is going to fall in line. And so I'm going to spend a little bit extra time, and then I'm going to ask some extra questions of those. I'm going to make sure that they feel success in this classroom for a couple of weeks in particular, because I know that's going to cascade through the rest of the classroom. And that's something I found in a lot of classrooms that I've worked in. And yet it almost feels a little bit daring to admit it, that sometimes we do have to deal with these things on a personality level. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you made there. I'd like to also briefly to circle back on the idea you talked about from Hawk's Farm Step, where they were looking at having a route around the room. It's something that I hadn't really considered when I was thinking through what I was going to talk about in this episode. The idea of, okay, so what am I doing to be most productive while the children are having these conversations? I have a tendency to, and even when I describe it, I use this word, I have a tendency to float rather than have a route. And I think over time it becomes a route, but whether I consciously plan that out as well as I should do is certainly something for me to bear in mind the next time I get to be in a classroom for a considerable period. I think it's a really interesting point.
My first point was a little bit broader, and having something in place, a system in place that allows for listening. Because Andrew Jeffrey talked about listening and how important it is in the start of season 3. Matt talked about it in the middle of that season. And I think it's more than just off you go. It's having something in place that you know what's being discussed, and it may be as precise as error tracking and as having a rule around the classroom. But I think the idea that you are taking in as much information from the pupils as possible, I think that's the important thing. So I wouldn't be too hard on yourself for not having a pre-planned route. It's an excellent example of how deeply Matt and his colleagues think about that kind of thing. But it's when I thought about what's the principle here, it's not just being off you go. it's going beyond that and taking back as much information as possible.
That ties in really nicely with something else that I think is worth discussing. The idea that our classroom conversations, peer-to-peer, they need to be really purposeful and planned. I mean, I've been into lessons and I've conducted lessons where a bit of, well, turn to your shoulder partner and talk about X has been just me keeping children awake. And there's no problem with that. There's no problems with just a quick, okay, I can feel that the attention is starting to drift a little bit. Let's get them a little bit more involved. That's not necessarily a problem. But at the same time, if that's the kind of limits of your purposes for classroom discussion, then you're very much not using it to its to how as well as it can be. So thinking in advance about, well, when am I going to use this moment of think, pair, share? What question am I going to ask? And going back to exactly your point, Kieran, what aspects of the discussion am I going to be listening in for as I go around the room? What misconceptions am I attuned to? So yeah, I think making sure that it's something that you plan. And again, we've talked about planning recently. That doesn't necessarily mean something you've written down in detail. It just means something you've thought about before the lesson begins. I think there's lots of the little bits and pieces that are really valuable for classroom discussions. Again, this links back to something you mentioned when you were talking about CPD that you've been part of, Kieran. Note-taking. When we talk about think, pair, share, sometimes saying to children before they have their discussion, or even while they have a discussion, saying, well, you've got your mini whiteboards. I would like you, as part of your discussion, to write down 2 things or 3 things or 1 thing, or I'd like you to write down these 3 or 4 things before you have your discussion. That can be really valuable as well. And I don't just think that on a classroom level. I've done enough professional development now, I've led enough professional development that I can see what leads to more productive conversations between adults, and being able to say, okay, we've talked about this. I'd like you to take notes relating to these 2 or 3 questions silently, independently, do that for a couple of minutes. And as soon as you've done that and everyone on your table has done that, feel free to have a discussion. It's far more productive when it comes to conversations about things we've been learning than here are some questions, talk about them on your table. Far more productive because people really explore what they do and don't know when they're taking those notes, which gives them that sense of curiosity and purpose that drives that discussion that comes afterwards. So yeah, just a little bit on think, pair, share, maybe including the use of mini whiteboards and note taking, I found to be pretty positive.
I think one of the things I was thinking about there as you were talking, Chris, what are the correctives? And I know I'm turning it on his head a bit here now, but I want to how do we think about the correctives for oracy here? Because I know there'll be so many teachers listening to have a tough class, right? Where behavior isn't necessarily the perfect idyllic norms and cultures that the ECF lays out, that we're aiming for, the nirvana. The often lived reality of it is that we don't get to that nirvana. we get as close as we damn can, but we don't necessarily get there. So my sort of thinking is what are the correctives for oracy? How do we go around without sort of crushing conversations, but also at the same time, do we pose sort of questions that help guide children, but are not too intrusive? I don't know. I know I've broke the format a little bit here by asking a question. I'm just really interested in hear both of your expertise, because you both have a lot to say. So I really want to know what your thinking is, and then I'll listen to you and then see if I've got anything to add, because I think it's a really interesting one about how do we interact in that. So I know we can model, but in the same way we would correct behaviors, what are your thoughts on that?
Classic LWJ curveball. I'm pretty sure you threw one of those in last time you were on. You may not get invited back much more often, Lloyd, if this is going to be the way things go. If you think about the stuff I've written before, I'm trying to guide acceptable or beneficial responses as much as possible before you get in that situation. There are certain phrases that will work in a conversation that can make them more productive because they lead to an expression of what the pupils have thought. My big thing is that pupils, they may understand, they may see patterns, but they can't articulate what they see. And if we provide them with a scaffold, and perhaps then if you're tracking and you refer back to the scaffold, and that was fantastic, where's the because, or what's the why? And then push that conversation on a little bit further, because you don't necessarily want to get involved in a mathematical conversation at that point, because that defeats the purpose of the error tracking, because you're trying to pick up what's the big idea that's been missed here, or where are we going wrong? And then you go back and you do your instruction, you do some more examples. So I think, yeah, it's having a scaffold for me, and then pointing pupils towards the scaffold, because, you know, they're not going to be able to, you know, they don't become articulate and eloquent overnight. But if they're in the same situation time and time again, eventually that becomes a part of who they are and how they approach dialogue, you know, just going right back to what you guys were saying. So I think, yeah, it's have a scaffold and guide towards that when you hear that it's not being utilized as effectively as you might hope.
Yeah, it is a great question, Lloyd. And I'm always keen to engage in the conversation that gets into the practical elements of it. It's very easy on, especially on a podcast, to start talking about all the, oh, we can do this and I like doing that. And it gets away from the practical day-to-day realities. I would say the things that jumped into my mind when I've had classes where I've struggled to engage them in productive conversation, like peer on peer. Firstly, I'd say if you're trying to engage them in conversations which are more than peer on peer, when there's, say, a group of 3 or 4, don't do that. If that's not working, stick to pairs and stick to the same pairs for a period of time so that becomes predictable. I would also say something I've done is, and this kind of ties back into something we talked about earlier, where I have a tendency to float, to try and gather information. If I've got a class where I think they're struggling just with the behavioral expectations, effectively, of collaborative talk, I will stay at the front of the room where I can see everyone and I can see whether that discussion is happening for a while. Eventually, where things are really working well, I might start to move around the room. It's worth noting as well that it isn't necessarily the front of the room that's the best place for that. Sometimes the back of the room is even better for that, where the children know that you can see them, but don't know whether you're looking at them at that moment. I know that sounds a bit like I'm acting as a security camera, but really actually just being at the back of the room for that can be a bit more supportive in some ways, rather than, so they know that they're being observed, but at the same time, they don't feel like you're glaring at them. Can be a really nice way to deal with things. You make that a teaching point rather than saying, today I'm going to be using partner talk in order to facilitate the learning of mathematics. In the back of your mind, you're thinking, today I want the children to get better at partner talk. And that's your goal. Because you're going to use it across the rest of the year as a pedagogical tool, at first you're thinking, how do I build up to this slowly? So you might start off with small chunks of time. So talk to your partner about this very simple thing. What answer did you get? 10 seconds, off you go. And then you gradually build it up. Equally, you can use things like sentence stems. So things like, okay, we're talking about something we liked about this chapter in the book. Here's a sentence stem I'd like you to use. And even scaffolding it as far as, okay, children on this side, you're person A, put your hands up, person A. Children on this side, you're person B, put your hand up, person B. Today, person A is going to go first. Because again, it's these little structural elements of partner talk that some children struggle with about who goes first. And so making that quite structured at first and then loosening the reins over time can be supportive. When it comes to talking about modeling, is the idea of, oh no, we want complete sentences, we want whole sentences, we want children to talk in full sentences. And I'm sympathetic to that point of view. I think there is definitely a case in which we can support children to be more clear in their spoken communication, but it's that I'm focused on. I want them to be more clear rather than just moving towards sentences that sound like they could have been read from a book. And part of that, more often than not, I don't know if this is your experience, guys, you can probably feed back to me on this. I find the thing that children struggle with most is not just going on and on and on and on and on and on and on, and not knowing where to draw a line, or not thinking in advance how to be brief. Ironic, given that I've now talked for about 2 minutes non-stop. But yeah, I find that that's supporting them to be concise is a really big challenge, and the thing that I focus on across a year. And sometimes that will just mean interrupting.
I think it's a really really valid point there, Chris. Like, there's naturally, with personalities, going to be stronger personalities than others in the classroom, and when you're structuring and supporting oracy in the classroom, it's something you have to consider, and you have to, like Chris said, you really do have to explicitly model for both parties. One, when someone needs to bring things to a close, that's a bit of emotional intelligence from that. You know, we have a duty to develop emotional intelligence, be able, the ability to read a room, read what's going on in front of you as a social cue, but also the ability to speak up and to go, sorry, can I just, and step in and have this say. And children famously are not, well, adults famously are not very good at it. Like, my dad would talk for Wales. Like, after, I did chip in, I've just had 3 days of it. I would chip in, like, at the end of the day, if nobody models that for you, if nobody makes that explicit, if nobody kind of codifies that for you, then there will be some people that just will never learn that, and so I feel this kind of echoes back to that kind of, again, I'm coming back around to the ECF. Like, I just think that the attention to detail in there, in terms of codifying things that we should have codified a long time ago in teaching, and that is now thankfully has happened in a lot of senses, and I know TLAC's also very good for doing that as well, and but getting down and actually saying out loud, this is a thing that needs to be taught and needs to be explicitly said. I think that there's such a power in that, and realistically, if you want children to engage in the process properly, then you have to do that. I think it's really interesting as well, just finally, in terms of, like, I go back to the question, like, in terms of what we do and how we correct it, because my head is thinking, like, it's a fine balance, isn't it, between when you intervene as a teacher that is going to stop a child that potentially has worked up the courage to explain something back to the partner. I think, so I'm going to crack this here, and it might not be correct, or it might not be right. And then it's knowing that as a practitioner to say, okay, I'm going to let them go with that a minute, just because you know your children and you know your context, and you know that they need that confidence to talk, and they might be wrong, right? And I know, that flies in the face of smashing down misconceptions and what have you, right? Yeah, I know that, and it probably isn't a popular thing to say, but it's important, isn't it? When you think about relationships, and you think about if you want to foster the right culture in your room, you've got to know that stuff. I think that, and you've got to be able to work as a practitioner, which makes it that much harder when you're an early career teacher, because you just don't have that experiential knowledge of seeing children in that situation, seeing those interactions thousands and thousands of times, and going, oh, I know that he or she needs that bit of space here to do that. And again, I know that's not a nice, neat takeaway for you from the podcast, but I think it's worthwhile talking about, because I think it's a pertinent sort of issue when considering oracy.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. There is such a person-to-person, class-to-class, individual element to talk and how you deal with partner talk in particular. I would say something that might be a more general takeaway, though, and this is something that people will be sick of me hearing me say, but I think being careful with praise when children are having had that conversation, when they are feeding back, the use of, I've not really got a term for this yet, but I guess neutral encouragement, just like, oh, thank you, great stuff, let's move on. But also knowing that that's what you're going to say, regardless of whether the answer is mind-blowing or whether it's something that isn't quite right. So that children, just, again, as I say all the time, you take the pressure off, not just from how you deal with things when they're not correct, but also by how you deal with things when they are correct. Because if, one child hears, oh, that's incredible, wonderful, and then the next child hears just, thank you, it feels like a real kick in the guts.
I find it really interesting, as you guys were speaking, when you're thinking about, okay, how do we make this really practical? How do we scaffold this for anyone who's listening and wants to improve how they structure their talk? Are we in the scenario where, when we're training pupils, like the when the problem difficulty is high and the mathematical difficulty is low. Is that the same kind of situation? Or if we have the task that's not really that challenging and not that really engaging on a cognitive level, will the pupils buy in less? And I don't know if I found the answer in my head as I was listening to you, but I'm thinking, okay, do we make these structured talks things that everyone can access and then go from there? Or does there need to be a certain level of cognitive demand that we include in these for pupils to buy in on a realistic level? Because obviously we don't want them to just sort of phone it in, so to speak.
I was going to add to that actually, Kieran, because that was what I was thinking as well. as we were talking, I was kind of thinking to myself, does this rely on children having enough knowledge, having enough competency with what they're doing? And then when we think of deficit between potentially children who may not receive or may not, or maybe coming from more disadvantaged backgrounds, not having as wide a vocabularies, as wide a knowledge base as other children. So I guess I'm sort of angling towards that question of when is the right time to do it, and I guess that comes back to professional judgment around when you sort of you structure that policy for them, because that has to play in, doesn't it?
I think there's a bare minimum of challenge that's required for partner talk or any activity really to be engaging. And I know that's almost a dirty word in education, but to literally make children go, well, this is something worth doing. There's a purpose to this. And that links back to what we were talking about earlier about something being planned and purposeful. I think alongside what Kieran's saying there, though, I definitely think it's the case that if I were looking to stretch children in what I wanted them to do with the talk, and I were looking perhaps for the first time for a kind of partner talk that might lead to a really structured answer where they might expand on something, talk for 3 or 4 sentences, relative, like kind of quite far down the school, it's probably going to be the case that the cognitive demand of what I'm asking them to talk about is a little bit lower because it's something that they're really familiar with or they're beginning to master. A really good example of that, or I like to think anyway, I remember a few years back I taught The Invention of Hugo Cabret with a bunch of year 5s, and this was a class where I'd struggled with partner talk, and it was something that they had worked on it in previous year groups, etc., but it just wasn't something that was a strength of theirs. And what we did with each chapter of the book was retell the story from the beginning using a text map. And by the time we got to, say, chapter 9 or 10, they had retold in their own words and heard a partner retelling chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, etc. And it was the way we did it. I did it was that there was this kind of rally back and forth. And whenever I said, okay, and switch, the other partner would take over carrying on the story. But the key point about this was that by the time they had got to kind of chapter 9, 10, etc., all of them, even the most reluctant of speakers, were quite confident in what they were doing. And some of the sentences that I heard them using to talk through the book and what happened, the plot summaries, were really great to hear. And I think in certain cases, having that in the back of our minds, thinking, okay, this is going to be quite a complex thing that I want children to do in their partner talk. So I'm going to make sure it's something that they're quite confident with, something they're quite familiar with, is perhaps a relatively sensible way of doing things. And equally, the other end of things, if something's particularly cognitively demanding just to kind of think through, then it might not be the time to introduce a bit of or a strategy in partner talk that they're not particularly familiar with.
So I think if we're rounding off how we can make the most of it, I think I had a point about carefully plan them into your lesson sequence. And I think, you guys spoke to that, where you almost sit back and you look at, here's the sequence. When am I going to benefit most from having this? And knowing precisely why you want to use talk. But my final point was not to assume that because a pupil is proficient in a subject, that they'll be able to guide a conversation with someone who's less proficient. And I think it's very easy to assume that because a pupil is really good at mathematics, that they'll also be quite confident in terms of how they engage with dialogue and can structure, their peers. And so, I think if we want to get the most out of it, I think we avoid that situation.
I think that's a very, very sensible point you've made there, Kieran. I think there's an easy trap to fall into, isn't it? You know, to not consider carefully that we're asking one child to explain something to another child that relies on both our subject knowledge and the ability to explain. It's not just the pure knowledge that it rests on. You know, that's what we do as teachers. We instruct and we convey knowledge in that way. So it's a really, really important point, isn't it? And when you think about how children interact with knowledge and interact with each other, it has to be a consideration. I think, like, as well, it's worth mentioning for me the fact that when we give these opportunities for oracy, that we really genuinely want to be forensic about what is going on with the oracy in the room, and that we are not just doing this from a purpose of this is something that needs to be in a lesson because of the legacy of what should be in lessons. And I think that is so prevalent in primary teaching, probably other teaching, in terms of it is the ingredient that you must have in your lesson to make lessons, and actually not really paying attention to the detail of what is happening in that talk. And that I know it's a really simple point there, and it's nothing particularly profound, but I do think that it's an important one, like, because I just think, so I know I'm speaking for myself here. I have done it because, now I've asked a question, now they talk to each other, and now I'm going to walk around a bit and I'm going to but am I actually listening? What am I actually doing with what the information I'm receiving from the children that are talking to each other? What am I gleaning from that? What do I need to do as a practitioner to help structure for children who are potentially less confident with their oracy? That's the point I was sort of making. Sorry, but you're absolutely right. It comes back to that point of, like, you know, expecting children to just go off and do it. And that's kind of, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that teachers are just, you know, going off and looking out the window for a couple of minutes, you know, but it's about really, really honing in on what children are doing. And that then informs what we do, because that's it, isn't it? That's the formative nature of teaching, isn't it? It's like, what does that mean about what we do next as a teacher for their oracy?
So then I suppose that leads on quite nicely to, when might it be most useful to utilize talk, and when might it best be avoided?
I think that partner talk is such a versatile pedagogical tool that it's hard to narrow it down to just a few things. But I think it's worth pointing out a couple of things where I think it's particularly valuable. I think whenever we're asking children to reason about something or give their opinion on something, questions that begin with, say, why or how, or why do you think X, Y, and Z, I think that's a really excellent time to use partner talk. Again, this is relying on certain relationships and certain routines and behaviors being in place. But I think that's a particularly valuable time. Also, where children are in some way discussing alternatives. So what I mean by that is, let's say we're in mathematics and children have been adding, 87 add 46, and we've seen around the room that there are different methods. Getting children then to say, okay, so how did you do that? Or did you find a way that was different to your partner? And if you had the same method as your partner, can you find another method that someone else in the room might have done? I think as soon as you've got alternatives that are equally valid, that's a great time for partner talk, because firstly, it's just really good to talk about that kind of reasoning, but also because it validates the idea that there are different ways of thinking about things, which is, something that we always want to encourage in the classroom. When we're trying to retrieve something that's a little more complex, something that isn't just a, one word or one sentence answer, I think it's really valuable as a tool at that point. I've mentioned it already, but the idea of, retelling a story using text maps or this sort of thing, you can do that on a whiteboard and you can assess, I guess, to some extent that way if you want to. But beyond assessment, just the idea of getting children to remember something and to think a bit more deeply about something, partner talk could be great for more complex retrieval, I think.
Cognitive psychologists might call that elaboration. I know that in the Learning Scientist book, Understanding how we learn, they talk about elaboration as something that can be really beneficial in terms of committing things to long-term memory. And so, yes, I think I'm definitely with you on that one. My final point would be in terms of, when it's most useful. We've often talked on this podcast about when we want to guide people thinking and we want them to think really hard about something. And it's knowing what it is we want them to think about and then setting up these really carefully structured situations in which we can guide, because, we're not going inside their heads, not within the next 20, 30 years anyway. So we have to find other means. And I think this kind of situation, where we have them elaborating in a structured way with a partner, I think that allows us to focus their thinking in a particularly productive and beneficial way.
I think the only thing I would add, and again, sort of a final point here from me, it would be that consider when in the learning sequence you want to open it up to this. I think, are you going to be launching into a lot of this right at the beginning when it's in its infancy? I'd argue that potentially that might not be the best idea, but maybe leaving it a little bit further down the line and looking at the ratio of how much of those why and how questions, like Chris said, you ask compared to when that's happening in the sequence of learning. I think that's a really important point. And again, for early career teachers, something that is more complex. For teachers who are more experienced, have more of a handle on it, because well, I'm not going to submerge them in that, because they're going to, they'll drown without information. They won't be able to process and have those conversations. So it's knowing when to deploy. It's like we say on all episodes to that, it's that armory, it's that toolkit. It's like when to deploy the right strategies at the right times. And I think with oracy as well, I think that needs a consideration. It's not to say you don't have any talk opportunity. I guess it's the type of talk opportunity you have and when is really, really important to consider.
Linked to that, I think generally speaking, I don't tend to ask children to do a bit of partner talk at the point where I think they're confused. And I've seen this in classrooms. There's a tendency to say, oh, well, hopefully it will come out in the wash. They'll have a little chat, and the one in the pair who has understood this will support the child next to them. And then now, for me, when children are confused about something, they've made it clear that they're holding a misconception, I want to kind of, for want of a better phrase, take charge of the discussion for a little while. I might bring it back round to partner talk, but that will ideally be at a point where I think, children are beginning to grasp this, or they're gaining a bit of confidence with this. Personally, I'm a big fan of, when it comes to children doing a decent chunk of independent work, I prefer to have something close to silence in the classroom. I find that if you have that bit of chat effectively that's going on in the background, even if it is seemingly productive and seemingly relating to what you're talking about, particularly in a subject like mathematics, it's quite easy for children to end up hiding that they haven't understood something. By being able to have a chat with someone across the table and say, what did you get for question 3? Oh, you got that. And then writing it in their book, which can make life significantly more difficult when it comes to us working out which children have really understood. So I think I'm quite the fan of silent independent work, or a chunk of silent independent work. How much of that there is obviously dependent on the age range that you're teaching. In some cases, there might be none of that if we're talking right down at the bottom of the school. But as you move through the school, the importance, I think, of that silent work increases. Sounds like an obvious thing to say, but I don't think partner talk is a particularly valuable thing to do if we're dealing with formative assessment. Again, sounds obvious, but I've been into classrooms, and I'm sure at some point I've done this myself, where effectively I've said, okay, have a think about this, talk about it with your partner, and then I've asked for some kind of feedback based on that, and then the lesson has progressed, because I've thought, oh, okay, it seems like they've understood this. Well, possibly just half the class have understood this, and there's half the class sitting there a bit lost by it, but their partner knows it, so they've kind of, they've got away with it to a certain extent. Effectively, things like think, pair, share, great for getting children to think about a bit of learning, but as soon as you're thinking, oh, okay, I want to assess what children have understood, it has to be something that is independent of that, something that doesn't have a little buttressing element of partner talk to begin with, because obviously then you're not really finding out what the children know, you're just finding out what they or their partner know, which is significantly less useful.
So Chris, we set out looking for 375 ways to make the most of talk in the classroom. How did we do?
We talked about the importance of routines and expectations, including things like sharp timings. We talked about making sure that it was purposeful and planned. We talked about, as a key strategy, think, pair, share. We discussed the idea of building confidence and adapting what you do to the personalities and relationships that you have in the classroom. Part of that being things like using neutral encouragement, careful, thoughtful listening, and being, to use your phrase there, Lloyd, kind of forensic in what we're looking to do around the classroom. Supporting children to be clear and concise, not just through modeling, but also through the ways that we deal with the conversations as and when, where we, bring a conversation to a close, where we ask children to rephrase things in fewer words, perhaps. How we needed to consider the demand of the task itself when we were considering the type of peer talk that we might request of children, and how we had to be careful not effectively to overload children with two things that were new to them. And we also, towards the end, I would say, talked about how to make sure that we don't use this kind of talk when we're looking to assess something or when children are confused about something. And by that, I mean partner talk. Obviously, we would use, you might use classroom discussion for some kinds of assessment, but again, that might not deal with the whole class.
So 8 ways to make the most of talk in the classroom. And I think hopefully, I've really enjoyed that conversation. Hopefully those who are listening will find it useful, particularly, those who are less experienced, because I reckon the more experienced, like you said, Lloyd, the more natural this kind of setup will be to you, but I think all that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you very much.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.